Hello everybody, I'm Andrew Dunn and I'm the Senior Publishing Editor for the journal Royal Society of Open Science, and in that role I oversee the day-to-day running of the journal. Today we're going to be talking about this year's Peer Review Week, which has a theme of trust in peer review. And to help me with that, I'm talking to one of the journal's editors, a reviewer and an author, who I hope will be able to tell us a little bit about their experiences in those various roles. So with that, perhaps I could ask you to introduce yourselves. Perhaps Catrin, starting with you, please.
Yes, hello. I'm based at the University of Leicester in the UK, where I'm a professor of cancer biochemistry, located in the Leicester Cancer Research Centre. So I'm a cancer researcher by background with particular expertise in intracellular signalling and preclinical mouse models for cancer. So I've been a subject editor for Royal Society of Open Science since 2017, and I represent the biochemistry, cellular and molecular biology section.
Fantastic, thank you. Zoltan, perhaps you can tell us who you are, please.
I'm Zoltan Dienes, a professor of psychology at the University of Sussex. I'm a cognitive psychologist with an interest in Bayesian statistics and registered reports. And I've reviewed for a number of journals, which is my role here in this discussion is as reviewer.
Fantastic, thank you. And last but by no means least, Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily Mitchell. I'm a paleontologist at the University of Cambridge, and I'm interested in looking at the ecology of animals through deep time, from the first animals to the present. This year I've published in 2 Royal Society journals, Interface Focus and Royal Society Open Science.
Fantastic, thank you. We're glad to have you. Okay then, so thank you much for those introductions. We'll start then with moving to the questions. So to start things off, what does the term trust in peer review mean to each of you when you're working your particular roles, either as an editor, a reviewer or an author? And why is a trustworthy peer review process so important? And again, perhaps we can start with Catrin.
It's a really important area. So it means for me is really giving authors and readers confidence in the quality and rigour of the data and information provided in a publication. And this is particularly important in this day and age because we've seen huge technological advancements which have essentially transformed the publishing sector, so that there's greater access than ever before to published research and faster delivery of results. But of course, this comes with a number of challenges. I have to say that also within the university and research systems, there's a huge pressure on researchers to publish a ridiculous amount of work, with the emphasis typically on a quantity rather than quality. So with this information and increased pressure to publish, with there being many channels to choose from, there's just so much information, and sifting through all the material and evaluating these sources of information is really quite complex. So alongside this, it's really important that we have a rigorous system to cross-check facts in publications to avoid misrepresentation and exaggeration in particular. So this is where peer review comes in, is to cross-check facts and misrepresentation. And it's really important that trust goes along with that peer review process. So within peer review, an author will submit a manuscript, and then it's evaluated by experts in the field who look at the quality, originality of the information, for example, and then a decision is made about whether to reject or accept the publication or indeed modify it. And trust in that process by the community is really important, so that the process is rigorous, fair and beneficial. And to me, it's a necessary aspect of maintaining quality to make sure that misinformation isn't spread. And I'd have to say, imagine a world in which we didn't have rigorous peer review, what that would be like. There'd be all sorts of misinformation, wild claims, conspiracy theories, etc., and counterclaims. And we just simply cannot allow that sort of world to evolve. So speaking as an editor, that is absolutely crucial to me, that we have the trust and the peer review is fair but rigorous to maintain the quality. I hope that possibly answers your question.
Very well, thank you indeed, yes. I mean, Zoltan, do you have anything you can add to that, perhaps? An excellent starting point.
Yeah, I'm speaking from the point of view as a reviewer, which is my role in this discussion. I mean, as a system works, which I think it's imperfect as it works now, but the way trust plays a role in it is I never feel that I'm not trusted as a reviewer, and that's because as a reviewer I'm in a position of power, as is the editor, and it's the author that's therefore on the defensive, as it were, and probably issues of trust play in the author's mind psychologically, as the system currently works, more than the other two players, the editor and the reviewer. But I do think in that context, as a reviewer, I have a responsibility for living up to the trust that the author would want to see in me. And one way that that plays out is for me to see the manuscript in front of me as something objective, external, and not personal. But I'm just looking at the logical relationships and the argumentative and the rational relationships between the different components of the theory, the hypotheses, the data, the evidence, and how they link together. And my personal involvement in that, in terms of my theoretical preferences, shouldn't play a big role, because that's where you often see problems arise, the reviewer as the gatekeeper. I don't want these reviewers because they're just going to let in manuscripts that support their position and reject manuscripts that don't support their position. And that's the great fear of authors, right, when they submit papers. And it also, when you have that sort of tribal thinking, it undermines the system and undermines the whole logic of the system, because it just becomes a matter of luck which reviewers you have assigned to you. So that isn't, when you act tribally as an in-group and out-group, as a gatekeeper, you're not supporting the scientific system. So you have to let everyone know, by the way you write your review, that you're considering it fairly. You're not a gatekeeper. You're not writing this paper yourself, it's the author's paper, but you do want it to be balanced and any obvious mistakes in it removed.
Excellent. That's a fantastic summary from you there. Thank you. Which also leads very nicely into asking Emily, from your perspective as an author, how do you view the peer review process in terms of trust and so on, and particularly in relevance, I suppose, perhaps what Catrin and Zoltan have been discussing?
Well, Catrin and Zoltan have summarised a lot of the really critical points. But I think as an author, what you're really looking for is that the reviewers won't try to push their own agenda, and that they, as Zoltan suggested, they should assess from a very neutral standpoint. Is the data correct? Are the analyses correct? Are the conclusions correct? And not try to push their pet theory on the paper, or potentially reject it because it disagrees with what they're saying. And I think that's where the editor comes in as well, to help check that the reviewers are actually potentially not evaluating the papers fairly. But it is a really crucial part of the process, having trustworthy peer review, to ensure that even the best of us sometimes could make mistakes, and so it's ensuring that these mistakes aren't published. Very much so.
Well, the way I try and do that, incidentally, myself as a reviewer, is imagine myself having a conversation with the author. I'm seeing them in person. How would I engage in that conversation? So what I probably wouldn't do, for example, is have lurid descriptions of my negative emotional reaction to their...
Yeah, I've seen that though.
I've seen, I know, exactly. And it's not helpful. Yeah, it's just not helpful. And those same people who, I doubt they would probably be that way in a personal discussion.
Indeed.
In some way, it's an abuse of trust when the reviewer behaves in that way, in that position of power that they're in.
Anyone else have anything else to add on that front before we perhaps move on? Because they have a nice link, I think, between what we were saying there and my next question. So if we're happy to move on from that. I mean, both you, Emily, and Zoltan there, and indeed Catrin, talking about the role of the editor in the peer review process and how the editor's role establishes trust. So Catrin, perhaps as our editor today, can you expand a bit on what the editor's role is in ensuring that all parties involved in the peer review process can maintain trust in it and its outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Zoltan mentioned gatekeepers and that how the reviewers don't act as the gatekeepers, but this is where the editors come in, who do act as the gatekeepers and the final arbiters on the decisions related to a publication. And because they have so much power, they have the ultimate responsibility for ensuring trust in the whole process. So just for those that perhaps are not familiar with the editorial process, so the way an editor is involved in assessing a manuscript is at several stages. First of all, we'll look at a manuscript that's first submitted and decide firstly whether it fits within the remit of a journal and whether it's of a sufficient standard for that journal. And the go no go decision on that can often be based on whether the article is deemed to be of sufficient interest for that particular journal. And I've seen a lot of publications actually that just don't fit with the remit of the journal and are turned away for that reason, not necessarily because they're substandard. So there's those sorts of editorial decisions that need to be made firsthand. And then secondly, a really important role of the editor is to decide who the reviewers of the article are going to be. And sometimes the editors, depending on how the journal is structured, will pass on that decision to an assistant editor or associate editor. And at Royal Society in Science, we do have associate editors that we work with who will decide on who the reviewers for an article should be. And that decision is absolutely crucial. Because typically you would choose 2 to 3 reviewers for a given article, and it's really important that there's no conflict of interest or politics involved in choosing who those reviewers should be. So that's another stage at which trust is really, really important, that the editor is making the right decision and that the authors can trust the editor to make the right decisions. So with a lot of articles, reviewers are asked to suggest names of potential reviewers, and those are often looked at, but the editor needs to be really careful that they've screened those suggested reviewers and that very careful decisions are made, as I said, about potential conflict of interest. So that's a really important stage. And then thirdly, of course, after the reviews have been generated, the editor again needs to make the important decision of whether to accept or reject a manuscript, or indeed ask it to be revised. And that's obviously the last crucial decision that the editor will make. And it's really important again that the editor takes responsibility to uphold the highest standards in making that decision, that they've made the decision based on the quality of the manuscript and the highest ethical standards are conformed to. So it's really about the editor setting the highest standards for the journal and upholding those standards throughout the process. One other way in which the editor is involved is that they'll sit on an editorial board and often be involved in making key decisions about the journal in terms of, whether there's going to be an open peer review process or some other process. So that's important as well for the editor. And also sometimes there are conflicts that arise after publication, and the editor will get involved at that stage. And again, following conforming to the highest standards, ethical standards for the editor is really, really crucial. So by doing so, the editor will ensure that there is trust in the process. And again, if we didn't have that system, you can imagine what would happen. There would be chaos where prejudices and bias and politics gets involved in the decision making with regard to a manuscript, and we simply cannot allow that to happen because it'd be so detrimental to society. So I think editors are the gatekeepers there, I think, in terms of trust.
Certainly sounds like it. So you might perhaps say that if we didn't have peer review, we'd have to invent it, perhaps, to ensure that the trust in the scientific process is maintained.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so coming at it from the the other side, then I'm going to turn to Emily, please. So from your author's perspective, what do you look for in a journal to assure you that you can trust its processes and that the kind of things that Catrin has alluded to and spoken of there, and the rigour of its peer review? And from your perspective, what would a reputable journal look like, do you think?
So I look for journals where colleagues have published, colleagues which publish very interesting studies especially. What's critical to me is that the studies seem, from my perspective, to be very rigorous, that the conclusions are supported by both the data and the analyses. And so I wouldn't submit a paper for a journal where I'd seen a paper that, for example, the statistics was incorrect, or the data was a little bit shaky in some shape or form. And so a reputable journal looks like, for me, is one where lots of colleagues have published, maybe have an editor that's very well respected within our field. And I'd stay away from ones where you don't consistently see good publications coming out of it.
Okay, great stuff, thank you. I mean, you referenced there good data and good statistical methods being applied. I suppose perhaps there's a question there in terms of the peer review of those. I mean, is there something to be said for journals having particularly rigorous processes to ensure that readers, editors, peer reviewers have access to those data, the models and so on that authors have developed?
Absolutely, and you're seeing it a lot more in the last kind of 5 years or so, that you do need to submit your data and you do need to submit your code if you're using code for a journal, so it can be reproduced. I think this is a very critical process. You need other people to be able to replicate your results based on your manuscript, and it's fantastic that this is really opening up and becoming a lot more commonly accepted with different journals.
Brilliant, thank you. And again, I think there's a nice link into Zoltan. My next question for you, in terms of the sort of trusting the process from a peer review's point of view, what kind of element does trust play for you when you're deciding whether to accept a peer review request as a reviewer?
Well, just following on from the conversation you were having, just a few years ago, I signed up the Open, what's it called, the Open Peer Review Initiative, set up by Richard Moray and some others, in which I pledged I would not review a paper if they didn't submit the data, or give a good reason why the data is not there. And I've continued to have that policy ever since. And in fact, it was by pledging to that as a reviewer that I thought, well, I can't consistently demand this as a reviewer if I didn't follow this policy myself. So it was at that point that I said, my name will only go on a paper if the data is submitted at the point of review in a repository like OSF. So, I mean, yeah, that's certainly part of the process of trust, is the data is there, in the sense that we shouldn't be just trusting the authors to sit on their own data and say, these are the analyses. We need to see that data to potentially look at them, or to allow anyone to look at them. I mean, one better than that, which I only know one journal that does this, which is the American Journal of Political Science, is they have a team that checks all the analyses. When a paper is submitted, they check all the analyses and make sure they're reproducible. And errors always, almost always found, and everything's cleaned up. That would, if that became widespread, that would certainly increase my trust in papers and make me feel more comfortable as a reviewer as well, because I would know that that sort of nuts and bolts bit of the paper was well covered. But as a reviewer, I can't do all the analyses, redo all the analyses myself for all the papers that I review. Eli had something a little bit better I think it was in just one article, where the data and the analyses are there in the manuscript, so that anyone can play around with them. The reviewer can play around with them and see what they get just by toggling different parameters. Maybe that is the future for all submissions eventually. And then the reviewer's job would indeed be you'd be much more comfortable as a reviewer and as an editor come to that. Come to that as an author as well. You'd know, you'd feel a lot more comfortable there weren't mistakes slipping through.
So I'd like to just add a point regarding making your data freely accessible, which I absolutely believe in. However, there are some paleontology sites which we can't make freely accessible because they're very, very vulnerable to the fossils being stolen. And so when I've worked on these sites, what I've tended to do is not publish the locations of these sites, which is not ideal, but it's needed to protect the fossils. But if the reviewers want the data, then of course they can have it. But it's often when we're working on these sites, actually, we wouldn't be allowed to work on them if we were going to publish where they were. So I appreciate there are some admittedly quite niche instances where we do need to be a little bit more careful with the data. And in conservation biology as well, if you have very valuable species, you need to be careful about what data you're publishing. But generally speaking, it's much, much better to have all the data publicly available.
Yeah, I had just to add in the medical field as well, you know, patient confidentiality is really, really crucial. So sometimes, you know, it's difficult to make that data, you know, publicly available without it being anonymised, obviously. But it's, yeah, that's something to consider as well.
Okay, so to some extent, then there is perhaps a question in developing trust, not about a universal data access policy, but appropriately applied data policies, I suppose, to the context as universal as possible, but with exceptions where necessary, I guess, then. Okay, that's
right,
great,
yeah.
Thank you. Excellent, thank you. Okay, we'll move on then to preprints as our next topic of conversation, which I think we can probably all agree are now an integral part of the publishing landscape. So I suppose the questions then to think about are, how do preprints fit into the peer review process? Do they affect levels of trust in science, particularly in scientific publishing? And given this is a bit of a free-for-all, perhaps I can ask you to, again, speak in turn. Perhaps I'll start with Emily, perhaps, please. If you could perhaps talk a little bit about your thoughts on preprints.
So generally speaking, I love preprints. I actually started off in maths, and then preprints were big kind of 10, 15 years ago. But the main difference, I guess, with mathematical subjects is it's very easy to spot ones that haven't been written by a mathematician. So there wasn't so much of a problem of trust because you could see literally in the first page whether or not it was a rigorous paper. But things are quite different now. And I produced preprints actually for both of the papers that came out this year in Royal Society journals. And my main motivation for doing that was I was applying for grants and wanted to be able to cite them, because while they weren't accepted when they went in, they probably would be by the time the grants were being reviewed. And it's very, very useful on that front. The caution I have, I guess, a bit with preprints is when the press picks them up. And we've seen this at a very kind of dramatic level with the COVID papers, the press jumping on them before they've been peer reviewed. For me, obviously, in paleontology, it's a lot less important, I guess, to the wider society. But we did have the paper from Open Science picked up by the press before it had gone to review. And that's something I'm not really comfortable with. I think it's much better within science. I think everyone can be very reasonable, but I think it's very different when you start getting journalists involved, and it's a lot more caution is needed. And I don't think most people in the general public appreciate that. And the results may not change dramatically, but it still is potentially a huge source of lack of trustworthiness. So generally very good, but yeah, when you start getting journalists involved, it gets a lot trickier, I think.
Fair enough, fair enough. Zoltan, perhaps you have any thoughts?
I now, I mean, as a review, I don't think it's affected me much. I mean, it's more as an author, I always put up preprints now. It's a way, as you were saying, Emily, I can refer to that work immediately and potentially get feedback on it from other people. So I think preprints are here to stay. It just makes it's to do with transparency, I guess. It makes information widely and easily accessible immediately. And any paper that's behind a paywall, well, there's a preprint. It makes it available. So I'm for preprints in general. And I think they're here to stay. I don't think it's affected me as a reviewer in any way. I don't. I don't think it's affected that job. But probably the thing that's affected me more, that's not quite to do with preprints as a reviewer, is the registered report process, where the reviewer discusses design, method, and statistical analyses before the data are collected, and then you'll feel like you're part of a collaborative team of people that's going to make a difference to this paper, and then that is put up as a preprint, as a stage 1 preprint. So in that context, the reviewing role is dramatically different, enhanced, and I think it does involve more trust in that context, because you are working together as a team on the registered report.
Just picking up then on registered reports, just as a slight aside, and declaring the interest that Royal Society of Open Science use registered reports rather. Are there circumstances that a registered report, the registered report process, can enhance the trust in the peer review process? And are there circumstances where actually it's less relevant and less useful as a mechanism in the peer review process, do you think? So certain types of study, perhaps?
I think it should enhance trust in the peer review process in that the reviewer knows what they say about any aspect of the study makes a difference. If they say this control would be better if done this way, or if you did this measure, there's then a discussion amongst authors, reviewers, and editor that makes a difference to how the study is run. It's not too late. Whereas with a standard article, if a reviewer says, oh, it should have been this measure than that measure, well, it's too late. So the reviewer makes a difference to the process in the registered report, plays a more constructive role in that way. And I think that enhances trust when you're collaborating together like that.
Fantastic, thank you. And Catrin, to finish with you and thinking about preprints, go back a step. Do you have anything else you'd like to perhaps add on the preprint point of view from perhaps an editor's perspective?
I agree from the author point of view. It can be a really useful, in terms of grant applications and getting your data out there. But from speaking with my editor hat on, I am a little bit concerned, I have to say, that there's maybe some data getting out there that's not being rigorously peer reviewed or looked at. So I have to say I am a little bit concerned about how much trust and whether it's just a license to a bit of a free-for-all, I have to say. So from an author's point of view, yeah, because it gets your data out there, but with a qualification on that it doesn't go too far, I guess.
Are there things that perhaps that either journals can do or preprint services themselves can do to allay your concerns, isn't it, from the editor perspective with preprints and that sort of free-for-all problem you refer to?
Well, I would like to see all preprints having been through the peer review process and not released until that point. I guess there's other ways that authors can publish data other than going through a journal, through a blog or whatever it might be. So that's a little bit of a different scenario. But in terms of the definition of a preprint, I think going through the peer review process first and comments addressed, etc., is crucial. So yeah.
There is a sort of a in between. I don't know if you know of peer community in. Where you submit a preprint and then it's not a journal, but it has the equivalent of editors, which are called recommenders, and the equivalent of reviewers. So your preprint gets reviewed by a recommender and editor, and the editor then writes a sort of a short piece, sort of a news and views type piece on why they recommend this article, and that's all done sort of for free, as it were.
So that's what I'm concerned about. That's what I'm concerned about, because it's not been through a really rigorous process.
So why isn't peer community in rigorous?
Pardon?
Are you saying peer community in is not rigorous?
Well, it's not to the level that a peer review process in a journal would have been taken through, with 2 to 3 reviewers that are experts in the field assessing it with additional editors.
Peer committee is the same. It will be experts in the field picked by a recommender who will be an expert in the field. Run with rigour.
Well, maybe, I guess, yeah.
Well, perhaps at this point of perhaps divergence of opinion, we'll perhaps move on to the next topic for this today. And I'm going to turn to Emily first with this, I think. Although if everyone else has views, we'd be delighted to hear them as well. So we'll talk a little bit about open peer review, which we've mentioned in passing a little bit so far. And for those who aren't aware, open peer review journals such as Royal Society of Science will usually publish the peer review reports and potentially signed peer review reports associated with a published article or some variation of that. So Emily, one of your recent papers, at least, that in Royal Society of Science, had the full peer review history published alongside the paper. What are your thoughts on that? How does it feel to have the peer review comments out there? Are there benefits for you as an author, and does it affect, again, trust in peer review, or your trust in peer review?
I think it definitely does help, trust in peer review. And it's also fantastic because there are elements that reviewers sometimes will misunderstand, it gives you another opportunity to address them. So if people are reading through more carefully, they can see essentially what's likely to trip up other people and see how we've addressed it. It's also very, very good for seeing kind of how the manuscript may or may not have changed. I mean, I don't think this particular paper changed much, but maybe sometimes there are big differences, especially in terms of conclusions based on your data. I also think it's really good because, unfortunately, sometimes reviewers can bring in personal conflicts from outside, which they shouldn't, but they do. And by making them open, it's a wonderful opportunity to have people actually assess, like, would I actually say this to someone in person or not? And because it's publicly available, you'd hope people would be a lot more professional about it. I'm also quite a big fan generally of signing reviews, but I think that's something that we need to be a bit careful of, because especially for kind of early career researchers, I think asking them to sign a review where they've potentially been critical of a professor is something that could have very real world consequences on their career. So while I think people should, if they want to, I really don't think it should be forced, especially if you're being particularly critical of a paper. But generally speaking, I think open peer review is a very good thing.
Excellent, thank you. And Zoltan, do you have a thought from your reviewer hat perspective?
I don't really have anything to add to. I agree with what Emily said. I think open peer review helps make the whole process more transparent. So you see the discussion that happened and the reasons why things were changed or not changed, and the back and forth, and that is very useful for making the process open, transparent, and therefore inspiring trust in it. And I also agree that it's good to make the content of the review open, but it should be optional whether it's signed or not, for the reasons that Emily stated.
Great, thank you. And Catrin, last but by no means least, any sort of closing thoughts?
Yes, I agree with all of that. I mean, it's really important for transparency and accountability, I think, and I think that's been proven. The question about whether reviewers add their name to the reviews, I tend to agree with the comments there by Emily that, you know, that's difficult for early career researchers, and actually some women as well, that you know, have tended to feel that you know, they might be on the back foot if there's potentially a conflict, and I don't think that's necessarily the right way to go. But certainly in terms of the reviews being open and published, absolutely. So I think there's a lot of mystery sometimes with the review process, and sometimes it can take too long, and perhaps authors think there's some strange things going on in the review process. And this is why the publication of the reviews adds to, you know, means that there's not so much mystery and there's more transparency, and it's easier to track down sort of where mistakes and errors have been made and what corrections have been made in the process. So all in all, it's a fantastic way to go, I think. And yeah, for all of those reasons is the transparency really, and to ensuring the rigour and quality of the system. I have to say, one of the good thing about open peer review is it can sometimes help weed out the bad reviewers from the good reviewers. And obviously, if we have a bad reviewer that's bringing in sort of politics and you know that are not welcome, then those bad reviewers can be weeded out with an open peer review process. So again, increasing the trust in the system.
Fantastic, brilliant. And I think that's a really excellent place. There's a lot more we could unpack with this, but I think it's a fantastic place to leave it. Thank you, Catrin. So I think that brings us close today. Thank you to each of our panelists, really, Catrin, Zoltan and Emily. Thank you for your time and sharing your insights with us for this year's peer review week. And perhaps we can get you back next year for the next topic.
Okay.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers, thanks.